We're going to begin this episode with a Latin term, Communicatio Idiomatum. And when theologians use Latin terms, they tend to do so because there's something significant in the term. So, step 1. Let me repeat the term to you again. Communicatio Idiomatum. Now on to step 2. Let's unpack what these two Latin words mean. The simple English translation is communication of attributes. To get a better understanding of this, we need to break it down a little further. So let's start with the word communication. Don't think of communication as simply a language event. That understanding is a starting point, insofar as a language event implies a sharing of something. But not even sharing gets to the heart of the meaning. Better English words to use are exchange or transmission. And what is being exchanged is more than information, as is evident in the next word. So let's move on to that next word, idiomatum. This word is a little less intuitive for an English speaker. Attributes is a good starting point. Other terms that can be used are properties or characteristics. Perhaps the best way to understand the term idiomatum is to break it down with some examples of the divine and human attributes that are exchanged in Jesus Christ. As for the human attributes, Christ assumed the characteristics of being born, sleeping, and eating. In fact, as we're told in Philippians 2:7, Jesus took the form of a servant and so experienced weakness, fatigue, fear, suffering, and dying. Theologians use the term kenosis to categorize this part of Christ's nature. Simply put, he set aside his divine powers, humbling himself instead of using his divinity to exalt himself. Additionally, the incarnate Christ had the very real attributes of the divine, such as having no beginning, not sleeping, not crying, and not sinning. These divine attributes, as set forth in Colossians 2:9, and known as genus majestaticum, include power, might, wisdom, glory, and perhaps as important as them all, ubiquity, that is to say, omnipresence. Now, there's two words you probably don't hear thrown around at the coffee shop, ubiquity and omnipresence. In fact, they weren't thrown around the beer halls in Luther's time either. He never used the terms. Nonetheless, the terms are often used in Lutheran theological conversation. So if you're ever stopped in a coffee shop and asked to define these terms, here's your answer. These are the fancy words that we use to say God is everywhere present. That was step 2. Now let's move on to step 3. The reason these terms are important to know is because of the role they play for Lutherans in setting forth the difference between what we teach and what the Reformed tradition teaches. To explain this a little more, think back to the sacramentarian controversy between Luther and Zwingli. This is where the word presence comes into play. This word is the sticking point in the different understandings of the Lord's Supper, specifically the divine presence. Luther understood that Christ's true physical presence of body and blood was under the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper, whereas Zwingli, as well as those who followed Calvin in the Reformed tradition, did not understand this to be the case. Zwingli and the subsequent Reformed tradition influenced by Calvin held to a philosophical principle rooted in the logic of metaphysics. The Latin phrase used by Reformed theologians for this principle is finitum non capax infiniti. The finite cannot contain the infinite. The way Zwingli posed the question to Luther was, how can Christ be in your bread and also seated at the right hand of God? Luther's counter to this was the understanding of what happened in the incarnation, which is the Communicatio Idiomatum. The divine attributes and the human attributes were fully found in Christ before the cross and after the resurrection. Later Lutherans would then reply to their Reformed counterparts, finitum est capax infiniti. Simply put, the two natures of Christ demonstrate that the finite can and does contain the infinite. So, Bread and wine can and do contain the divine essence of the body and blood of the resurrected Christ. Since everyone listening to this has some experience in scientific reasoning, it wouldn't be surprising to find yourself leaning toward Calvin's perspective. But before you think that Luther and Lutherans have lost their sensibilities, listen to how Luther described the divine and human presence in Christ, as well as in the Lord's Supper. Luther borrowed an important distinction from William of Ockham and Gabriel Biel that describes two different ways of being present. On one hand, you can talk about the presence of something in a local way. You can use the image of a wine barrel for this description. Wine is fully present in a barrel. As it fills the barrel, its presence can be apprehended and measured. That's the way our scientific brains would comprehend it. On the other hand, you can have something present in an unmeasurable way, but it is definitively present nonetheless. Think, for example, of the soul in the body. You know it's present, but it cannot be apprehended or measured. So, Luther could stress that the omnipotence of God and his incarnation are not contradictory. That was step 3. Now let's move to step 4. Why does any of this matter? Let's start step 4 by quoting 2 renowned theologians who've written extensively on this topic. The first is Gerhard Forde. He wrote, quote, "Christological formulations, like all dogmatic formulations, lead us inexorably into the world of abstractions. As such, of course, they are impersonal, non-historical. They are, after all, constructs to defend us from mortality, our way of escaping the ravages of time, our grasping for something that does not die," end quote. In a similar vein, Oswald Bayer wrote the following, quote, "One goes astray theologically if one either speaks only speculatively about the person of Christ or discusses his work of salvation only in terms of the historical effect it has. Neither Christology nor soteriology can be understood apart from each other, neither the person nor the action of salvation," end quote. Both of these men were responding to the evolution of the conversations and debates that came about surrounding the subject of the Communicatio Idiomatum. One begins to see a pattern of theological infighting, as well as a perceived need to address disputes with other Protestants, in Articles 7 and 8 of the Formula of Concord. In those articles, we see Lutherans engaging in language that results in what Forde identified as eventually ending up as metaphysical monstrosity. Why the harsh assessment? Because Bayer and Forde understood rightly that such theological work was unproductive at best, if not futile, for the actual mission of the Church. And what is that mission? It's to free each sinner from the constant gaze inward as they search for an identity or a certainty within themselves. How does this freeing happen? Let's look at Luther's Small Catechism as a good case study. When you read Luther's explanation of the second article of the Creed, you find that Luther does not start by talking about Christ's nature as human or divine. Rather, Luther begins by speaking about Christ's work. Luther says, "Jesus is my Lord." But note, he does not go on to talk about what a Lord is. Rather, he proceeds to talk about what Jesus does. In the Large Catechism, Luther says, Lord simply means the same as Redeemer. Note the salvific activity at the center of Luther's views, not the metaphysical description. Simply put, Luther understood the nature of Christ is for me. That is to say, Christ's nature is applied to me, communicated to me. Now we can start to get a sense of why Luther emphasized this Latin phrase, Communicatio Idiomatum. Recall what happens in the Communicatio Idiomatum. The communication of divine and human attributes in Christ are essential for salvation. In Christ, the human being, God experienced in his flesh wrath, the consequence of sin, and the meaninglessness of death. At the same time, Christ, the human being, was victorious over death. Furthermore, in the resurrected Christ, who is also God, The human nature is now omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Finally, let's go back to why Luther took up the Communicatio Idiomatum in his fight with Zwingli. Salvation itself was at stake in that fight, not simply theological nuance. Luther understood that the Communicatio Idiomatum is not simply a matter of how we understand the two natures of Christ. Rather, the Communicatio Idiomatum is the key matter in the Lord's Supper. How so? Because in the handing over of the body and blood, the bread and wine, with the promise of Christ's forgiveness, we sinners are now experiencing the breaking in of God's kingdom, eternity itself. We are experiencing the ramifications of the resurrection. What occurred in Christ is a rupture in our old way of thinking. No longer do God and humans exist as one standing over and against the other. Rather, God has come in human form to dismantle the old rebellious world of sin, law, and death. And how does he do such things? Through his word of promise. Upon receiving that promise, the sinner is drawn into God's own being, into God's act of salvation. When God addresses the sinner with his word, the person is created completely anew. This new creature finds an identity outside of himself in the one true God who speaks him or her into existence with his word of forgiveness and new life. In the person of Jesus Christ, God gives himself to us, rupturing our old ways of thinking and existing.